Good morning and welcome to this morning's program. We're going to get started, and as you join, please, we invite you to put your name and your organization in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. Just a big hearty good morning to everyone. I'm Kyle Caldwell, President and CEO of the Council of Michigan Foundations, and on behalf of our team and our trustees and all of our other members, I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's program. How our values shape our work. Thank you for attending today's event, which is our first in our 2021 Equity Signature Series. Over the course of this year, this series will feature a slate of conversations, special conversations, to provide learning and focused opportunities for you to increase and deepen your grant craft approaches and understand better your equity-centered approaches with tools, resources, actionable insights to help you and your foundation take the next steps in your equity journey. We're going to begin this year's series at the very core of what it means to put equity at the center of our work by exploring how our decisions, our policies, our procedures can both underscore and then sometimes inadvertently even undermine our values, and how our values shape our work as individuals and collectively and as organizations. So before I introduce our esteemed panel, just a few housekeeping notes. First, we invite you to actively engage in the chat throughout the session to share your comments, your reflections, and your questions with one another and certainly to me. We'll also be watching for the questions in the chat for our panel. There's going to be time dedicated to dig into the Q&A all together. Please do keep yourself on mute throughout the session. That helps us all really clearly understand and hear our speakers. But please note that the final 15 minutes of the program is going to be held for what we're going to call the lobby, or our virtual lobby. And this is intended to be a space for open conversation among the panelists and attendees, mirroring that good dialogue that sometimes happens after an in-person event, where you're standing up, you're turning to your friend and peers to have a conversation, or you're just trying to make it back to your car for your next meeting. We'll invite you all to, on the line, who are interested, to turn on your videos and turn off your mute button and just join in a more open conversation. And so we'll be sure to, if you can, we'd love for you to stick around for the lobby portion. That'll start just about 11:15. I want to turn now to the program and then today's just illustrious panelists. First, Dr. Shakaya Smith, who's the Vice President of Organizational Culture at the Fetzer Institute. Tamala Spicer, who's the Senior Program Manager at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. And Shantias Ford, who's the Interim Program and Knowledge Director with Peak Grantmaking. And today's facilitator and my dear friend, Dr. Juan Olivares, who's the former Distinguished Scholar in Residence for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Johnson Center, and President Emeritus of the Grand Rapids Community College and President Emeritus of Aquinas College. Juan, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and thank you all for joining.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you, Kyle, for having us here today, and for CMF for creating the space for this really, really important conversation today. And good morning to everyone out in the audience. It's delightful. We hear there's a full screen and more. All of you have a reason to be here, and we hope it's to better your organizations and to learn something from today's conversation. So I am also very delighted to be a part of this panel and facilitating these distinguished guests. They are outstanding practitioners. Many of you know them. They will bring us knowledge to learn from, practical tactics to use, and also insights for reflection today and hopefully beyond. Today's topic of values and how they shape our work is really, really important. And we need to continue these conversations and perhaps even start them if we haven't, to explore what equity in the center of our work really looks like. So let me make some opening comments to frame this conversation this morning. It's critical to explore our values and understand the importance of how they influence the development of our grant making, our workforce, and also our planning at every level. To do this, we need strategic, consistent, and deliberate processes to develop our mental models, and more importantly, to describe our behaviors that lead to the desired outcomes that we want, that we look for all the time. This exploration and understanding of how values shape our work is not a one-off. It takes deliberate conversations over time and deliberate application into decisions, policies, and practices. We're not born with values. We acquire them throughout our lives. And working in ways that align with our values makes it easier for us to prioritize all the things that we have to do, and less likely that we'll second guess the decisions that we make. Values are a key component of a healthy workplace culture. We know that, but it's hard to achieve, and we know that too. These values and the clarity of how our organizations and our staff are to behave are really important, and they help us with that. They provide a framework to test decisions and guide our interactions with others. Values tell our staff what is good for the organization and also what's unhealthy. Work values are the qualities, the principles, and the standards that really matter to you and to our organization, because values reflect our sense of right and wrong. They help us grow and develop, and they help us create the future we envision and that we want to experience. Think of values like a compass. They help guide everything we do. So values within our philanthropic organizations don't just help us determine what we do, but how we do it. Sometimes, however, what we say and what we do are not aligned. And likewise, what the organization states as its values may not be observed in how they function. So reflecting on what we believe and what we find important enriches our sense of self and the role that we play in our organizations. And that's why we're here this morning, exploring the how. How do we make this happen? And what does it look like? That's really important. What does it look like in ourselves and in our organizations? So to start the conversation, I'll turn to our panelists to get a brief glimpse into what they bring to the conversation. And then I'll go deeper and ask them some probing questions. So panelists, just to get our conversation primed, briefly tell us, from your knowledge of the subject and your experiences, what are you bringing to this conversation? Who'd like to go first?
All right. Hi, everybody. So excited to be here. So I enter this conversation as somebody who's charged with leading and practicing our organizational culture work for the Institute. And so really my team, which includes our HR, our DEI work, and then also our spiritual community work too, which I might say a little bit more about that. My team and I, we wake up thinking about this notion of mission integration, or how it is that we embody our mission and our values. One of our partners had this question that I found really beautiful and provocative around how do we practice the world that we want to create? And so our mission at Fetzer is helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. And so following from that, the vision and strategy of my work in my area is really about creating the conditions and infrastructure for a spiritually grounded, beloved community. And as you can see, that's really tied into what our mission is. And this is not just on paper. I think the first thing is that we have an organizational function for it, which is not typical, right? Like I lead our Department of Organizational Culture. And then our team designs around it. So we really have frameworks and practices and theories that we grapple with as a team and think about how to design for that and how to integrate it through our HR policies, our DEI work, and our different ways of being and functioning organizationally. So I get really excited about these conversations, especially thinking about how we enact our values and how it is that we practice the world that we want to create. So as well as individuals, but also organizationally, right? So I'm holding the personal and the organizational at the same time. So really, I'm bringing more of a focus on the internal enactment or manifestation of our values, and really excited to be here with the other panelists.
Thanks, Shakila. Thank you. Great.
I appreciate that so much. And at the Johnson Center, so much of my work centers around working with nonprofit organizations and at times working with those partnerships between nonprofits and foundations. I was excited to see board members as people were telling us their organization and where they were from, because I often come into organizations when there perhaps has been a clash in values, and that's not always how people frame it, because we don't name this well in organizations. But when there's a clash in someone believes one thing and another person believes another thing in an organization, that's usually where they call a consultant. They bring me in to help solve problems and to help solve challenges or help them point in a different direction and create clarity. And so often what I'm bringing to the table is picking back the layers and thinking about, I love what Shakia said about the mission, right? Waking up every day and living out the mission. We have great mission statements. Many of us don't take time to look at those on a regular basis and say, what does this really mean to how I show up, to how I do my work, to what policies we have in place, all of those questions. And many times that's the work that I'm doing with organizations, is picking those pieces apart and saying, really, what are we grounding ourselves in? And that is a values conversation. We don't always frame it that way. We don't always name it that way, but it is a values conversation. So very happy to be here today and excited. I'm excited for this conversation after I met the other panelists. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks.
Hello, everybody. To round out the panel, I'm Shantia Ford, the Interim Programs and Knowledge Director at Peak Grantmaking. And I echo everybody's sentiment about being super excited about this conversation, even in just our planning call, just really digging into the content and really thinking about this from different perspectives. I could just tell we were just going to have a really engaging conversation, so I'm excited to dig in. And my perspective and where I'm coming from, my mental model that I'm bringing to the conversation is being a staff member of Peak, of course, and Peak Grantmaking. If you're not familiar, hopefully you'll get a chance to check out our website and key into some of our resources that I'll be sharing about. But we really work with our network. We have over 6,000 members that are funding institutions and individuals, grant-making professionals, that we really support and uplift and push towards equitable and efficient grant-making practices. And so one of our principles, we have 5 key principles for effective and efficient grant-making practices. And one of them is tie your practices to your values. So this was just really a key conversation for us, and one that we've been having with our membership for years now, and one that we'll continue to lift up, because we definitely see a disconnect in the sector between what funders and foundations values are, what their missions are, and how they practice that, how they execute that, and how that shows up. And we're talking both internally within your funding institutions and organizations, as well as externally. How does this show up with your grantees, with the relationships you have with your community, with the relationships you have with staff members and potential grantees? So just a lot of different constituents that we really look at, and we try to really push our members and the philanthropic sector towards really building those equitable practices and really lifting up equity and all of that work. So that's who Peak is, that's who I am, and I'm really excited to dig into this conversation and talk more about that, and even share some of the recommendations and the conversations that we've had around this subject. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you all for sharing that. You bring a lot to the table. So let me go to another question that hopefully will create some conversation between us. But I'm going to turn to Shakia and ask her this question to get us started, and then hopefully that will lead to some conversation. So this is a burning question with a lot of people. How can we build an inclusive workplace culture that encourages our supporters, staff, and trustees to bring their full self? How do we make sure that they aren't being asked to check those values at the door?
Yeah, I love this, a very juicy question that we think a lot about. And I will say this as a kind of like caveat or disclaimer, that I really think about these questions as lived inquiries and things that we have to, like, even though we do, like I do this every day for a living, and I still have to come back to it each time. And in my team, we're constantly coming back to it as a community. So I just wanted to offer that up first for everybody, because I don't think it's, you know, one, I don't want to position myself as like having figured this out, because I think there's, you know, it really is a living inquiry that we all are inviting you all into. But just from my experience of this living inquiry, is the first thing is just holding it as a value and a commitment. Because, and we were talking about this earlier, the panelists, you know, I think a lot of organizations see this clear demarcation between values, including spirituality, and our deeply personal notions is sometimes inappropriate to bring to workplaces or organizations, and sometimes dangerous. So I think even just allowing or just saying that we do want people to bring their full selves to this space and this conversation, including their values, this is welcomed, I think, is the first step. And we certainly, you know, look at our mission statement, right? Like we lean into these types of conversations and questions around values and purpose and even spirituality at Fetzer, and how it supports our common work, right? Like we see it as critical to the work, not just some aside. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is once you have that as a value and a commitment, then it's something you can, you know, really live into. And it's really about cultivating intentional practices and ways of working that in that inclusivity, which I will say that, you know, that sounds neat and good on the surface. And, you know, it is neat and it is good to do. And it's really hard because it's slower when you include more people, it gets more gnarly. There's a lot of, you know, Tamala's talked a lot about, she'll talk more about this, I'm sure, about these tensions, right? Like I know that's something you think about, and being willing to lean into that is not easy, but I think, again, once you commit to that as something you want to practice, then you kind of like build in the structures. And one of the ways, just as an example, that we've done that at Fetzer is really try to think about who we invite in, and this notion of, you know, we often think about community building externally. Well, we also think about it internally. So how do we build our internal work community? And so one of the things that we did, we developed a compensation philosophy a couple of years ago. You know, we could have just done that at the leadership level, but what we did was we had a whole process that we went through with our community to really invite conversations about compensation and value, and how different members of our community were thinking about that. And we used you know, a particular visual methodology of photographing. That's a whole story I could tell. We could spend the whole time talking about it, but just to say, you know, that was a decision point that we made to build in that structure. And even though it did inform our compensation philosophy, which was a, you know, a particular outcome, it also built community in our, you know, in our staff, and allowed us to have some really beautiful and challenging conversations together. So the last thing I'll say about that too is we also think about, that's just one way that we've done that, but we also try to build in intentional regular spaces for these conversations. Like we have weekly spaces, not everybody can do that, but to just think about where the spaces that you can allow these conversations to happen. And we include our board into those conversations at different points too, so that they're part of our community. So I'll stop there. Maybe like others have some thoughts too.
I appreciate that sense of journey that you talked about. This is a journey. And I think one of the things we have to recognize in organizational culture is we all show up at different points in the journey. Every individual that walks through our door is at a different point in the journey. And that's okay. And so I think if we can sort of acknowledge that going in, that we may have a list of values posted in our organization, and these are our organizational values. But have we taken the time, have we created the space to ask people how their personal values line up, right? And that's part of showing up whole, to be able to come to the workplace and show up whole. It's vulnerable. It can be messy, but sometimes we have to go through that messy middle to get to a point where we truly have that inclusive culture. And I think that's where the tension comes in, is we hit that messy middle and we want to back off. We want to say, nope, we don't want to go there. But instead to press into that messy middle and say, okay, if we're really truly going to move toward inclusiveness in our workplace, if we're going to move toward inclusiveness in the way we do our work, two different places, right? Then we have to go through the messy middle. And we have to be able to kind of hold the both and, the now and the not yet. And I think that's the tension that we often run into in organizations. At the Johnson Center, we spent close to 9 months developing a list of working norms. We printed them out, we have them posted, we start many meetings going through our working norms. What we realized after living with them for about a year, year and a half, and the world's been different this past year and a half too, right, with COVID. But what we've realized with living within those working norms is we didn't really take time to teach our staff how to respond when one of us wasn't upholding those norms. And so now we're in that place of saying, okay, there's a next step. We have to actually unpack and say, these working norms represent values for this organization, and in many regards represent values for individuals within the organization. But now that we have them, how do we actually live into them? Because it gets messy. And so that's the piece we're working on now. What is the training that our staff needs in communication, in navigating the messy middle? And how do I approach someone when I feel like they've violated one of those working norms? Where do I go? What's the process? What do I do? How do we create that safe space? Because none of this is going to happen if I don't feel safe showing up to work. And that's true of every individual in your organization. If they don't feel safe emotionally, none of this is going to happen. And so it's been an interesting process for us to kind of have that light bulb moment and go, wait a minute, we didn't actually teach people how to manage these working norms and to take that step back and start doing that hard work. And it's messy and it's hard, but it's also incredibly rewarding. So I think it's important for people when they start having values conversations in the workplace to recognize that it will be messy, it will be tense, and those things are okay. We just have to put some good guardrails in place to manage the messy.
Tamla, I definitely appreciate that so much. Both of you, I appreciate hearing both of your journeys around that. And I think there's definitely some synergy happening in the peak sphere as well. Particularly, we talked about this in our planning call around that safe spaces side of things. It's so imperative that we're building psychologically safe spaces for professionals, for in this field, for us to really, be able to lift up when there is that disconnect, when there are these issues. All of our organizations, or not all, but a lot of organizations have these mission statements and value statements that they put out. And we're talking about the individual side, so I don't want to jump the gun and talk too much about the organizational side just yet. But even when there's a disconnect with individuals, really empowering individuals should be empowered. Staff members should be empowered to be able to speak up and to have these conversations. And if you don't have that psychologically safe work environment, then there's so much that's not being said. There's so many opportunities for growth that just people aren't empowered to have. And that's a conversation we have, of course, at Peak. A good majority of our members are grants managers or grant professionals in one way or another. And of course, they're not trustees. They're not, the CEO. They're not board members. And oftentimes, they might even be seen on the lower end of the totem pole. So we're really pushing professionals from wherever you sit, leading from your seat, being able to advocate from your seat, whatever that is. We do an activity called Mapping Your Influence, where we talk about where you have influence. And maybe you can't go to your board members and say, hey, we need to change the way we do things. Maybe you don't feel like you have that power, but there are spaces and opportunities where you can speak up and where you should. And so we're really pushing professionals to be able to advocate for themselves and to say, hey, there's this disconnect here. I really feel like we need to lift this up more in our organization. And being able to do that in a safe and in a safe way where they don't feel like their job is on the line or they're going to be targeted, but that they can really have those conversations. And that comes from buy-in from everybody, from the top down and down, up from the bottom up as well. So yeah, I appreciate that.
And I think there's a difference between that psychological safety and being able to show up brave. Yeah. One of the things that popped into my head as you were talking is a couple of years ago, our associate director, who is now retired, she was having a really rough day. And I knew that she was a woman of faith. We had had many conversations about our own spiritual journeys and in how we shared many things in our spiritual journey. And she was just having a really particular rough day. And I walked into her office and I closed her door and I said, give me your hands. She said, why? What are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to pray for you because I really feel like right now that's what you need. And I said, I don't know what's going on, but I know you're not you today. You're having a hard time today. I said, I really want to pray for you. And she said, you can't do that here. We sit in a very secular university, public university. And I said, why can't I do that here? And she's like, well, look where we are. And I said, I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to pray for you. And it is okay that we do that in this space. We're not pushing this on anyone else. We're not forcing anyone else to engage. This is you and I being human. And I feel like this is something you really need. And so she said, yep. And so I prayed for her. And she said to me later, I think it was probably 3 or 4 days later, she saw me in the kitchen and gave me a hug and said, I really appreciated that you were brave enough to push a little bit. Right. And so speaking our truth in a space doesn't always feel safe. Right. It feels very brave sometimes. And I think it's important to, and I feel a little bit odd saying this with 2 women of color here on the panel with me, but I think it, because I know you have to do it every day in different ways than I do as a white woman. And so I think it's important though to acknowledge those things in the workplace. And that psychological safety is a question of, to your point, Shanti, is can I say certain things and not worry about losing my job? Can I say certain things and not worry about what's the backlash? What's the repercussion going to be? If I have a conversation with someone, do I have to wonder if 3 or 4 weeks down the road, it's going to come back? Or can I say things that that's safety. That's the psychological safety. Being brave in that space means we each have to do our own internal work to say what values are core to my being that I'm not willing to check at the door, right? That's our own internal work. So I think there's a difference in those things. In the United States, I think culturally we say that internal work isn't our business at the office. I would push a little bit against that and say it is our business at the office. One of the things we've done at the Johnson Center to provide an opportunity for people to ease into some tough conversations is we do both a movie club and a book club. And we watch the last movie that we did for movie club, we do it once a quarter. And the last movie was Crip Camp. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but it's a fascinating look at disability communities. There are many communities within the disability community. And it's great conversations that touch on our values. And we begin to name things. And I think that's part of creating that psychological safety. And it's also part of building that bravery.
Yeah, I love that distinction because we were having some conversations about psychological safety. And the thing that I found interesting about it was that it's not, sometimes people think safety means that I feel, that it's going to be easy for me to say whatever the thing is I'm going to say. And that's not like the people who talk about it, that it really is, can I actually show up with what I have is the psychological safety and not risk losing my job or like those sorts of things, not like that people are going to agree with me or even, necessarily feel great about what I have to say even. So I was like, oh, that's an interesting distinction. So I love that. And the thing that really struck me too with what you were offering, Tamala, is this whole notion of capacity building. And we really include that in our DEI framework, where it's not just about the content of equity and diversity, but we also did a lot of work, and we use the language of scaffolding in our community to kind of like be able to do the work of equity and values conversations. So we've done a lot of conversational capacity work. We also use norms too. We call them touchstones. And we use the Center for Courage and Renewal's touchstones that our community is very familiar with. But also we did a lot of work around, okay, how do you work with when somebody says something that you find difficult to sit with or hear? Like that's also a practice, right, of like engaging what happens in your nervous system and otherwise when you're encountering difficult information or difference. So I think that's been really an interesting, and it has seemed very slow, to do all of that work, but I think that is an important piece of equity work, helping people learn the different personal and interpersonal skills that they need to really be in inclusive community. Because being an inclusive community is not easy, and how do we learn how to encounter difference? And most of us aren't taught that anywhere really. So I'm finding that like if we do that work organizationally, that we have to help scaffold that for people.
Tamala, I want to go back to you and ask you specifically about this tension, which we know exists. You referred to it as messy, and I've been there many times in different organizations. But in this climate today, and I'm going to take a leap here, people are very divided on some issues. And some of those issues are inclusivity and what it means, trust and what it means, and a lot of things that touch our values. And so people are more and more polarized from one end to the other. Can you give us any examples or our thoughts about how do we handle this divisiveness? Because it happens in organizations, and it's one of the biggest tensions that I feel from organizations right now.
And I agree with you. We are living in a period of time where we feel more divided as a country than I think we've been in a long time. I mean, historians will point to different periods and say, look, guys, we've been through this before, right? But for those of us who weren't around in the 1800s, it's new for us. So I think for me, one of the things that I have practiced, and I will say practice because I am not always good at it, but I continue to practice in hopes that I will get better at it, is this notion of showing up curious. And I have, and so I sort of already alluded to my own journey has been within the Christian community. And nowadays, I even feel funny saying that in public spaces because culturally, people have a whole lot of baggage with that term. But one of the things that I've really noticed that in my own Christian community and also externally in other communities that I'm a part of is that we have a tendency to engage in conversation and we feel like we have the right answer. And so we're waiting to be able to prove that we have the right answer. And what I'm trying to practice is that I want to show up curious and kind of sit in the middle and say, okay, let me hear your story. I ask questions instead of making statements. I do a lot of executive coaching. This is probably one of the biggest things I have conversations with executives about is how do you show up in spaces where there's tension? Don't make statements, just ask questions. That, you know, there's a lot of terms, there's a lot of appreciative inquiry, there's a lot of different things out there, but just that idea of showing up curious and in really being able to set aside maybe even sometimes, and again, there's tension in doing this because I hold certain values dear and they really define who I am. At the same time, I also know that other people have very different values and those are just as important as my own personal values. And the minute I discount the importance of their values, then I've discounted them. And so that's why I try to show up curious and hold both of those things at the same time. We may have a conflicting value that's creating tension, but your value is no less important than mine. And if I can walk into a conversation with that perspective, it makes it easier for me to hold that tension. And I think sometimes it's just being comfortable with tension. It's just being comfortable with it and saying it's going to happen. And there's interesting research out there that says, and again, I do a lot of work in boardrooms. There's interesting research out there that says if we're going to make the best possible decision for an organization, we have to have tension. We have to have conflict. And conflict is a word we're all afraid of because we live in a country that it seems to be everywhere. Conflict does not have to be a bad thing. Conflict can be a really healthy thing in an organization, in a conversation, in a boardroom, because it can lead us to making better decisions. The key is what are the guardrails that we've set up so that when we enter into conflict, the conflict is elevated to focus on an issue, not an individual. How do we practice that, right? And how do we practice showing up curious so that when conflict arises, we're there to ask questions to try to understand what's the point of the conflict versus diving into the conflict. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and it's a practice. I'm not saying I'm really good at it. There are times where I'm really bad at it and I walk into a situation and I let all of the emotions take over and but it is something that I try to practice on a pretty regular basis. It's something I try to teach my clients.
Sure. That's a great point, Tamala, especially the guardrails when we talk about conflict. So if I value conflict because I believe it's good, wouldn't the next question be, what are those guardrails? Because conflict to you might look different than conflict to someone else. And you know that those can be very different in how we define them and what they look like for us. And so it's just an example of the importance of defining our values. And once you define them, what does it look like in real terms, in behavior? So anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I definitely want to jump in here because these are such really good points. And I really appreciate the piece around showing up curious. I think one of the grounding guidelines we have for our conversations, particularly those sensitive ones, is really around assuming the best intent from people. And if you show up with curiosity, you're saying, oh, why did you think that way? Or what made that thought come, So showing up with that curiosity is assuming the best and wanting to learn more from people. And I think that's really a best practice when it comes to some of these sensitive conversations, instead of, going straight to, attack mode, or, we talk about the different personality types and, how they can show up in conflict. And it's easy to to go from, your regular, peaceful self to when you're in conflict, just having that tension happening. So leading with the questions, leading with understanding, I think it's just a really great practice to try to get away from the tension and the conflict side of things, or get more to the understanding, because every tension does not have to be a conflict. It does not have to escalate to a conflict. So I can definitely appreciate that. And I also just want to lift up, I'm thinking, I feel like there's two different lanes we're talking about when we talk about this whole tension. I feel like on one side, we have organizations maybe that have these values, and individuals within the organizations that say, hey, those values aren't a good fit for this organization, or those values need some work, those values need tweaking, or who we are as an organization and the values that we bring are not aligned with the values that this organization says we have. So there's that lane that I want to lift up. But then there's also the other lane. And this might feel a little radical to some people, but sometimes it's just not a good fit. Sometimes your individual values do not align with the organization's values or the organization's values. And it's just not a good fit. And I think that's okay. And it's okay to acknowledge that and say, hey, I thought, and it's also important just to lift up in our hiring practices. We're talking about the Great Resignation right now happening, and people are shifting and moving. And this field is transient. And so much of that is a misalignment with values. And so when we're interviewing, when we're hiring, we have to be lifting that up. We have to be sharing, this is who we are as an organization. And when you come into this space, of course, there's room to grow, there's room to shift and change, but organizational values, if you're making a 3-5 year strategic plan, you're thinking about who you are as an organization, your founders have developed this over time. A lot of that is foundational. And so we have to be assessing the people that we're bringing into the fold that are representing our organizations, that are building our organizations, and making sure that they are aligned with who we say we are as an organization. And that also takes the work of assessing who you are as an organization and saying, are we who we say we are? Is that really coming up? Because we can't say we want to uplift transparency and everything we're doing is not transparent. And then we want to bring somebody in who's transparent. There's going to be clash there. And then we're going to say, oh, well, they're not aligned culturally. No, because you're not aligned with who you said you were. So yeah, I just wanted to lift that up as well. And I could talk more about that, but I know for the sake of time, I want to go ahead and get through the rest of the questions. But yeah, I just wanted to lift up that distinction there.
I think that's so important, but it also speaks to the fact that we organizationally, each one of our organizations has a responsibility to make space for and to really dig in and do that hard work of saying, what do our values mean? Don't just write them down on a piece of paper, have conversation. How do we live them out? What does it look like? What's the example? Create the picture. And every organization has the responsibility to think strategically about what is our future, so that as we're hiring, we are laying out on the table, here's the plan that we have in place. Here's what we do value. Here's the direction we're moving in as an organization. How do you see yourself in that landscape? Where do you see your values being lived out in that? And asking those types of questions in an interview. We're in the process right now of hiring a new director of learning services at the Johnson Center. And this is, we shifted, again, being within a university, we had to get permission from HR, but we really shifted the way we wrote our job description because we wanted it to better reflect our values. we've really shifted the way that we're approaching this hiring process. And like the questions that we're thinking about asking are different. Because if we haven't done our work as an organization, how do we expect to create good fit for people? But also recognize that individual values, I don't care who you are and what your organization is, there's going to be something that you're going to bump into. You know, I was working with our student senate a couple of weeks ago, and I asked, they decided they wanted to redo their mission and vision statement. And I said, so how best, or I don't remember how I phrased it, but something about how best do you go about doing that, right? Who are the best people to be involved? And I immediately realized that all the space, all the energy in the room shifted. And I thought, oh, I've just bumped into something. And I named it. I said, I feel like I've just bumped into something culturally in the organization. Can we bring it into the space and talk about it? And it was like, you know, do we have the courage to do that? And it's a practice. We have to practice. We might say, and we do say that in our working norms as well, assume good intent, assume positive intent. But that takes a lot of practice in my head and in my heart sometimes in the workplace to assume positive intent, right? It's the individual work that we have to do to assume positive intent. So,
yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's such an exciting conversation that is like a lot of resonance here too. And Shanti, I think what you were saying about recruitment is so, you know, people don't talk about that often, I think, but it's so important. I think we've gotten really good over the last couple of years because we have we consider ourselves a spiritually grounded community as well. And so, you know, that's a very particular type of workplace that we're inviting people into. You know, and it's radically inclusive, but we are clear about that as a key part of our identity, because that's the work that we're doing in the world too. And so how does everybody who comes into the organization know that that is who we are, and how exciting it is to join that? And we want people who are excited to be on that journey and also committed to their own inner work, you know, which is a key part of what we do. And so that is on our announcements and how we like talk to people about it. And then also how we onboard people. Like we have a whole HR process of like onboarding people that's very intentional, and people get assigned buddies to attend. You know, we have these weekly gatherings together that accompany them for the first 6 months of working at the Institute. You know, all of these, you know, and I'm being specific so that people can see, you know, what that looks like in practice. But I think the other thing is that struck me by what you all were saying, we realize that we don't all share the same understandings of our values, right? Like our values are love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion. And it's funny, I just did a piece of an onboarding or orientation into our organizational culture team for 2 new staff. And I started off the conversation asking them, I was like, this is a lot for 9 a.m., but what's your definition of love? And they're like, oh, I haven't even had my coffee yet. Why are you asking me this? And we went around, and I've had conversations like this with partners too. And it's so funny because something like love, which is in our mission, it's in our values, and we all have this idea about what it means to enact love. And we each went around and everybody has a different idea about it, right? Like one person, not in this particular area, but another conversation I'd had like that, one person was like, well, love is obligation to me. Because I come from a family and lineage where you're obligated to do things for people. And I was like, oh my God. And then this other person was like, yeah, and for me, you know, that has a trauma background, you know, like love is very, I don't know what that means. So even when we're talking about that, that's strange to me. So, and then one person is like, love is telling the truth or fierceness to me, right? So then even this one value, we find that that we don't share the same understandings and experiences of it. And so we're constantly having to create spaces where our full community, and we do this every year or in different pieces, engages with our values to talk about what does that mean to you, like what, because then what happens is, like you were saying, Shanti, is then sometimes we get into tension and conflict, which is fine, but around, you're not enacting this value the way that I think it should be enacted. And sometimes it is an integrity issue, but sometimes it's just that we don't have the same understanding. So sometimes I'll say to somebody, well, that's not my understanding of how love, of what love or equity means. And I am curious to hear about your understanding, but I'm holding that a little bit differently than you are. And then that's an opportunity for us to kind of lean into those tensions, which are beautiful, because that's where, that's where we kind of get shined and rubbed up against through these tensions.
And that's really, really important in an organization, to have leadership be supportive of that, especially from the very top, because having permission to have time to enter the space, well, first to create the space, but to enter the space, and then to be able to deal with the conversation in a way that is meaningful. It takes a very deliberateness. And my most recent position at the Johnson Center, we certainly had a leader that was very much valuing time to be able to explore these working norms. And then at every staff meeting, talk about them, not just for 5 minutes, but half hour, an hour, a portion of the staff meeting, of a retreat, a whole half day. I mean, really creating that space. And that's when the staff really know that it's important for the entire organization. I want to move us along because of time, because I want to dig a little deeper into the external world that we connect with, and especially grant making. Foundations are really built around grant making, and our values really affect how we do that, I would hope. And so I'm going to turn to you, Shantias. At Peak Grant Making, you do a lot of this, and you had told us early on that you do a lot of work in this space around grant making. Help us understand what that means in terms of values and embedding values in our grant making processes.
Yeah, thank you for passing me the proverbial mic. Excited to really dig in. And oh my goodness, there are so many different points I want to latch onto and keep going with. Many, we should have made this a 3-hour conversation. But yeah, I'm so excited to share a little bit more about what we're doing at Peak. And it's really aligned with all of what we're talking about right now, because we are seeing a really big push in the philanthropic sector with our foundations and grant making institutions to uplift equitable grant making. That's been the big thing. Everybody's talking about trust-based philanthropy and equitable grant making and how we can really uplift our grantees and support our grantees. And one of our principles, one of our other principles, is narrow the power gap. So we talk a lot about that power dynamic between funders and grantees, and really shifting that and making it less of this relationship where you're powering and hoarding over your grantees, and rather having a reciprocal relationship where you're learning together, you're supporting each other, you're working together and building something collectively together. So we're really trying to shift the narrative and shift the language. And so much of that is tied to this, the tied practices to value, because that's where we really see a big disconnect in the philanthropic space. That's where we're seeing this disconnect between what funders are saying and what they're doing. And that shows up throughout our grant making life cycle. It shows up internally, it shows up in the practices we have. And when I say we, I'm speaking funder, we. That shows up in the practices we have as funders, the ways we operate, and shows up in our grant making. We talk a lot about how grantees may see us as funders. And of course, because of that power dynamic, there's just so much that they're not saying and that they don't want to say because of the fear. Going back to psychological safety, the fear of what that might mean for their funding, the fear of what that might mean for the relationship. So there are a lot of opportunities that we're missing as funders to really support our grantees better, to really be better funders, because we don't have that door open. So we talk a lot about giving feedback, having feedback open, and having that not be tied to or contingent upon your funding. And having that transparency, that's another big piece we talk about, is building transparency in your processes, in your values, in your mission, in all of the things you're doing, your operations, building that transparency with your grantees, with your potential grantees, with your applicants, so they can see who you are and you can lead from that area. So when I talk about time, practice, to values, and I will say, I think somebody did drop it in the chat earlier, so I appreciate that. And I was going to drop it, but I started digging deeper into this. But we have a suite of resources. If you're not a PEAK member, hopefully you become one. So many different resources. Some of them are free and open to anybody. Some of them are gated based on our membership. Thank you. But there's so many different resources we have that really get to the time, practices, to values. We have action planners that really get to those conversations, and both of the other panelists have talked about how conversations are so important. We have to have those conversations internally and externally. We have to have the conversations on what are our values? How do they show up? What do they mean to us? And how are we showing those throughout all of our practices, from beginning of grant life cycle to the end? And we have some different resources that also get to the grant making life cycle for those of you that might not have the language or the, don't want to develop anything. We've already developed it. So all you have to do is pull it and go with it and say, okay, from the beginning, when we're sourcing grantees, what does that process look like? Mm-hmm. And is it aligned with the value we have? Maybe we have a value of transparency, but on our website, we don't have anything around how you can get a grant from us. You have to figure it out on your own. Is that really transparent? So having those conversations, thinking about what the values you have are, how are they showing up? And how are they not showing up? Where's that disconnect? And what does that mean for your grantees? And then even digging deeper into how we even started this. Who started this process, and what does that process look like? And being able to push and question and grapple. And I appreciate what you said, Juan, about having that space regularly. I don't think this just needs to be in your annual retreat or in your end of year performance review. If we're living and guiding through our mission, vision, values, we have to have that be a core tenet of everything we're doing. And we have to be reminding ourselves of that. We have to be aligned on that. We have to be transparent about that. And I love the example, Shaquila, you mentioned about love, the love value, because it's so true that can show up in so many different ways. All of these values. We talk about DEI. That's such a big value for people. And I could talk all day about DEI. Don't get me started on DEI.
Well, you sound like a great resource over at Peak, and those that don't know you, they ought to get to know you, and you have a lot of resources there. And there are many others, and I'm sure that CMF will continue to provide resources. Not to cut this short, because you're right, every one of these questions we can spend 3 hours on at least. But we want to give a chance to our audience to ask some questions. And I know that Kyle and Bridget are looking over the chat and maybe asking us some other questions that we can entertain. And let's give that some time. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Juan. Thank you to the panel for a great conversation. And you're right. We could do this for a week and still only scratch the surface. So I thank you, all of you, for condensing what we know is a treasure trove of great examples. So I have just a few questions, and Juan, I also want you to step out of panelists and step in as a respondent, because I know you have some experiences in this, both as a college president and certainly as a former Community Foundation CEO. So the first one, as I think, building onto this conversation about good grant making and grant makers holding up their values, we have a diversity of members: corporate, family, private, community foundations all have value sets, but all have to live them out a little bit differently. When you think about a family foundation where there is a living donor sitting on the board and everyone's trying to figure out his or her values and how the grant making ought to align, and then contemporizing that right into today. Or the donor is passed and they've got to live out the legacy. Can you give us some examples on how you've seen or dealt with an organization's values and how it's impacted maybe the grant making decisions in a conflict with the values, or the conflict with the nonprofit's values in the foundation's work? Anybody want to grab that one?
I want to share a story that was told to me by a funder. So at the Johnson Center, I'm not sitting in a funder role, but we often are engaged in these conversations. One of the things we've been talking a lot about at the Johnson Center is, especially in learning services, we've kind of coined this phrase inside out capacity building. So how do we help foundations create capacity within the foundation to better do their work so that they can in turn create capacity building externally? And so we've kind of grabbed onto this term inside out capacity building and really looking at what that means. And this was several years ago, I was working with a small, what I would describe as a rural foundation. And when we look across the country and we think about where does work get done in community, right? A lot of these small grassroots neighborhood, on the ground, small nonprofits that traditionally, historically, didn't qualify for grants from many foundations because they didn't have the audit. They didn't have certain pieces in place. They couldn't show, right? There were things they couldn't prove. We also have a lot of work across the country being done through churches, through congregations, through mosques, through temples. And it's work that it might not be a separate 501c3, but maybe they're doing a huge after school program. So in this particular instance, this funder had mentioned to me that one of the things that they were wrestling with their trustees as they were trying to make grant decisions is a church had applied for a grant, and it was a capital fund, a capital request, and they were trying to redo their bathrooms so that they would be ADA compliant. Now, on the surface of that, the trustees were struggling, going, we can't support renovation in a church. But you have to dig deeper and look at why. This was a small church in a very rural community that ran an after-school program that served over 200 children every single week. And the reason they needed their bathrooms to be ADA compliant and renovated was so that these kids who were coming into their building 5 days a week could have proper bathrooms. And so it's, when you look at that, and there's a tension sometimes. Well, do we want to fund this, what is seen, we're funding a religious community, but get to the why. And that's a values question, right? And when we look at our own practices in a foundation, and maybe we have inclusion statements, what do our inclusion statements exclude? And so these are questions that we have to wrestle with. And that's just a simple example of how this one foundation had to wrestle through a tough decision, but it became a values question. And it became a question of looking at their inclusion statement and say, what is our inclusion statement excluding? And so these are some of the things that we bump into that are very practical. And where are the guardrails? Again, guardrails are a good thing, but so is definition. I love that exercise of walking in and asking, how do you define love, right? What does that mean to you? We have to take time to define some terms. We have to take time to dig deep into what does this actually mean, so that as we're doing the work externally, it's aligning and it's making sense.
What I also heard you saying, Tamara, was just sort of take time to check your assumptions. Like you might think that your inclusion value is able to live it out fully, but don't be afraid to check it, right? And do step backs. So let's stay along the grant maker practice, grant craft conversation just for a little bit longer. The interesting dynamic that Tamara and Juan, I know you and I have talked about, is the unique power dynamics that exist within philanthropy, and it's beyond the transactional of granting money. and there's a hierarchy, and there's a servant leadership tonality that we put in staff and trustees, and right in this deferring to power and authority and those sort of things. And I'm wondering if you can address some of the challenges that might exist between trustees and staff when expressing, values related to operations or policies. And this, Shanti, this might be something that you all might, be leaning into from Peak. And I also want to make sure, Sakai, that you talk about it from Fetzer's Institute perspective as well. So just want to open that up, because I know all of your organizations, just in your day-to-day, you all have to deal with this, not to mention teaching others. Who wants to try to delve into that?
I think that's a great question and setup. Kyle, it's this power dynamic, and it does exist internally between trustees and staff. I've seen it, been part of it. It's something we have to grapple with, and I think it's important to call it. I think especially today, I think it's the big elephant in the room, that when we're talking about inclusivity, we're talking about diversity, we're talking about equity a lot these days, and there is pushback. There is pushback even in the boardroom. And staff sometimes, and the organization as an entity, struggles with that in terms of working with the nonprofits, working in granting resources and so on. But again, I think what you're calling out here, Kyle, is the importance of bringing your trustees along. So it's not just staff, because you get to hire staff and you can filter through, and you can, as Tamala was saying, construct your job descriptions and all that to be more equitable and getting who would fit in the organization. But trustees don't often get brought into these deeper conversations. They're volunteers, they're busy people usually, and yet it's so important, because I've seen a lot of it in terms of the staff being frustrated because trustees don't quite see it the same way. And let me add too that nonprofits, all of us in working in the social realm, might have a different mindset or definition of things than somebody in the business world, somebody in the legal world. And so we all kind of bring our mindsets, and it goes back to what our values and how do our personal values clash with organizational values, and who sets those. The board many times approves those kinds of things. So do be mindful of engaging your trustees at high levels, engaging them in training, and engaging them in some of the positive conflict and positive messiness that is created, so that staff and trustees come together, learn together, so that they have good common definitions going forward.
I'm going to turn this to you, because I know this is totally unfair. You may not have known that I was going to come to you on this, but that's just how we roll at CMF. The Fetzer Institute is a very dynamic organization, both as a learning organization, internally, externally, a grant maker, and one that is grounded in Mr. Fetzer's, frankly, belief and definition of love that everyone has had to interpret over and over and over and over and over again. That requires a very interesting series of conversations between trustees and staff internally, I have to imagine. You want to share any of that?
Yeah. I think I was thinking as this conversation is unfolding. I mean, I think the first thing to say that's not specific to us, I think power is always inherent in any relationship, between people and organizations. And so the first thing I would say is not to shy away from conversations about power. And that's probably the first place that people go wrong, right? That that we don't want to talk about it. So it becomes implicit and undiscussable. So, and then things really get weird, I think, when you can't talk about it. And so, and I think that, just that's something that we have to grapple with, because we are a spiritually grounded community too. And I think that's one of the shadows, just to be frank, of spiritual communities or spiritually grounded communities, that it's hard for us to talk about power and conflict and tension, all of these things that that don't seem part of like the spiritual experience, but they truly are. But just to say that that is, I think, a unique shadow of being in a spiritually grounded community. I mean, one of the things with our, because we are a spiritually grounded community, I think our trustees are also doing that work themselves. And in many ways, they see their group as holding some of the like spiritual lineage and heritage and vision for our work, which is really beautiful. So they get into ideas about operations or programs, but they also are holding the spiritual values for our community. And then as part of that, we try to also think of them as part of the Fetzer community, not just like there's the board and the staff, even though of course that exists, but when they have their board meetings, which are quite regular and extensive, they become part of the community in many ways, in terms of they do our practices with us, and we have, I think, deeper levels of engagement that may not, I don't know if it's very common in other foundation contexts, but I think that's part of the way that we try to live out our values in that. And I guess the last thing I would say about board staff stuff too, the other thing that I think is helpful to be explicit, which is not always made explicit, is what are our different roles and functions. I mean, even though it seems obvious, I think that's again one of those things that you have to constantly be talking about. In my former, before pre-Fetzer life, I had a lot of contact with nonprofits, and one of the things that I would see happen is this kind of like contentious relationship sometimes happening between staff and board, because there wasn't clarity about what was the board's and what was staff's role in certain things. And I think that's really helpful. Like I've, been in, even in Fetzer and some of our board interactions, and having them just be like, we trust you. We trust you, and like, thank you for sharing this with us. We have questions. We want to be journey with you in thinking about this. And we're clear that this is for you to run your the organization and like enact these things. So I think even having that kind of like clarity around what is ours to do is really helpful.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. So we have time for one last question. So I want to, Shantia, to come to you and talk about Pete in the frequent tool development that you're doing. So we've got just about 1 minute left. So I want to give you an opportunity to sort of talk to us about the more practical and other exercises or strategies that you would invite us to think about that help staff and trustees share their values, think about broader conversations. Do you recommend not doing this yourself, bringing out outside help? Just give us some real practical sense of this.
Absolutely. And I'm a master in being succinct, so I can do it quick. So I will say, of course, our resources, we have plenty of them. I also invite any of you to reach out to me personally. I'm happy to help to curate something and support your organizations and really digging into this. But we have our action planner that really gets to that and gives you a step-by-step questions to have, discussions to have, to really get started on this journey. A lot of times it is good practice to bring in an external person. I know Tamala could probably speak to that as well, but bringing in somebody externally, especially when there is tension, especially when there is a disconnect. I won't go too deep into the whole DEI thing, but especially as we dig into some of that work, and especially if you have people of color or marginalized people in your staff, oftentimes bringing in external people to really foster and facilitate that safe space is a good practice. Oftentimes, especially, it can be frustrating, and so I would also say acknowledge, especially if you have people of color, marginalized people on your staff that have been saying this and it hasn't been getting heard. So I would also say just acknowledge that, but having that external person can definitely be helpful. And I will also mention two other really great resources and best practices for digging into this work. One of them I will say is our online Connect community, which is a discussion board, a discussion thread. We have hundreds of people on there constantly. As you think of things, as you're navigating things, we're relying on each other and crowdsourcing that information and that guidance there. So it's a really great resource if you're not keyed into that, to just be able to connect with others and even just talking about your journey and where you're stumbling and connecting with each other. And even on a deeper level, the other resource I would say is our peer groups. We've got some amazing peer groups that we've really curated to support each other. We have some that are on their equitable grant making journey together, or really looking at time practices to values together. And they meet regularly and they talk about this and set that accountability and action item. So those are just some really great resources to really dig deeper into this, outside of what we already have on our website and we already have available for you. So
that's great. Thank you. So first off, we're going to transition into our lobby in just a moment. But before we do that, just a big, huge thank you to all the panelists for sharing, for helping us center equity in a conversation, and for sharing your own selves and your own personal story. So please join me in a virtual clap and applause to our panelists here. And so we appreciate, the time and look forward to welcoming folks to a future conversation and connecting opportunities. And we'll have highlights from our online event on our calendar on your screen, so you'll see those here in a moment. But Shakaya, Shantias, and Tamala, and Juan as our facilitator, thank you so much for the time you took today. So in a moment, you're going to see an evaluation link in the chat box, and you'll receive an email with the evaluation link as well. And we value your feedback and look forward to receiving your thoughts on any future programming you'd like to see, and things that resonated for you in today's conversation, because we want to make sure that this work continues. This is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And it's always going to be a continual conversation, one that rightly so should not have a conclusion. It should always have a living space in our work. I want to remind you that we're accepting proposals for sessions at our 50th annual conference. Can you believe that? In Grand Rapids, in person, November 14th through 16th. And so we hope many of you will submit a session. Hopefully some of today's conversation stimulated your thinking as well. And please consider submitting your ideas and invite your colleagues to do the same. And we want to make sure this is reflective of you and our celebrations. So officially now is the time you should be squirming in those terribly too uncomfortable chairs, sitting in a large conference room, and you're wanting to get up for your stretch break and be polite and not say, oh my God, I've been sitting too long, and have a conversation together. Just as you wrap up, do your stretch exercise, give yourself some breathing time, turn your video on if you haven't already done so, and can turn off your mute button and join the conversation. And we invite you to just share reflections or questions. All interruptions are politely, stewarded. It's going to be a little chaotic at the beginning, but that'll be okay. We're looking for the white noise conversation that happens, after these sessions. And, maybe share perhaps a challenge you're experiencing around what we've talked about, or even a heroic moment you want to celebrate. Anything for the rest of our time together. So please feel free to share.
This is where the best conversations happen, in the hallway, isn't that it, Kyle?
That's absolutely right. This is where all the work gets done too, right? Oh, I've been meaning to see Angela. I got to corner her for a moment.
Well, I'm seeing the Midland Area Community Foundation looks like a team conversation over there. So thank you so much to the group for being here. Nice. I just want to encourage people as they go about doing this work to be human together. Show up human together. And that means, knowing whether or not somebody just had a grandbaby or they have some family member in the hospital or whatever the case may be, right? What are those things that we can do to be human together? Because that'll make a big difference when we bump into differences.
Tamala, that sparks for me, and this is Angela Graham from the Fetzer Institute, and not something necessarily to be answered today, but it occurs to me listening to this that I think part of this is sometimes it can be very isolating, and I'm wondering if perhaps today's conversation seeds a longer conversation and how we formally and maybe informally support each other as we continue to carry this forward. So I just kind of wanted to seed that idea, not to make more work for anybody, but just to plant that.
Yeah, I know in the philanthropic field, I mean, there's a saying, one foundation and one foundation. We're all doing our own thing in our own silos. And you really, you'll dig into one and then you go to another one. And it's like, oh, y'all are doing things completely different, which is where that power in community lies. The power in community and connecting with each other and, being able to build those relationships across funding institutions and learn from each other and connect with each other. And I already gave my plug for our peer groups, but I'll just lift up and say, that's why they're so important, being able to connect with other funders. And I think about the PSO opportunity, philanthropy supporting organizations that have been professional development for me, that have been, I was a program officer before my current role at Peak, and, going to things like EPIP, emerging practitioners in philanthropy, and some of our regional stuff. I'm in Philadelphia, so I was working with the philanthropy network of Greater Philadelphia, and just being able to key in with each other and support each other and brainstorm together, and especially with some of those organizations that are still norming and forming and developing and figuring this out, being able to key in with others and say, oh yeah, this is what this foundation is doing, so we need to do it too. It's such a good practice to build that connection and make sure we're not too isolated and siloed. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that.
I think peer groups are important.
Yeah, it feels like a joy and sustainability practice in many ways of being connected with others. Because I feel like, and that's a deep question that I've been in doing this kind of like change work or culture work, which is not always easy, as Tamala was talking about. And as you all think about living, like what this means in your context, how is it that you build in practices for sustainability and practices for joy, which I do think being connected to our values, like there have been a lot of recent studies, like Pew has done stuff that how so many people are feeling disconnected from purpose and meaning, including like spirituality is part of that. And I think not only is it, about integrity in our values, but I think it also prevents burnout too. As we do this work, to be able to be connected to, especially when it gets hard to do equity work or when it gets hard to have these conversations about values and spirituality, to be really deeply grounded in why you're doing that, I think is so important, again, just for joy and sustainability in our work.
Mara, did you want to jump in? I noticed you unmuted.
Yes, I unmuted. I was thinking of entering the lobby, and I just wanted to say, if I was getting up from the session and walking to the lobby, I would have been turning to someone next to me and saying, wasn't that great? Oh my gosh. So I really just had to share that. And I would be like, the homework, the notes I've been taking. Plus, I think you gave us some good homework. I think like looking at those values and having that be a starting place, that inside out piece really resonated in terms of I come from a spend down foundation, so it's a very interesting model. Our board is related to the donor. He, no longer living. So just a lot of fascinating things in terms of, in the short time we have, how do we think about those values and what they mean internally, externally, and by the board. So just, I was, copied the chat, so you might hear from me, but appreciate all the good work today.
Or other folks' reflections, things that you wanted to share even with each other, just about observations, struggles, opportunities. Anybody want to talk about the gold medal count at the Olympics? I mean, this is the lobby. This is the things you really talk about, right? This is where the real stuff happens, right?
I know, I'm curious to hear how, well, I would love to hear the gold medal count, but also I'm curious to hear how other people, like, how do you create these opportunities and practices in your context? Because they're all so different to have these conversations. Are people having these conversations in their, together with each other? I'm just curious to hear what others are doing.
Hi, this is Lynn. Well, in Flint, at the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, we actually have a team of us that participated in an equity cohort directed by CF Leads. And from that, we created kind of an action plan for how we were going to begin to center equity in our office, in our work, internally and externally. And part of that was to create once a month, at least, staff meetings where we're actually having conversations or we're having presentations or activities. So we're in the midst of that. We have been kind of feeling our way and piecing together, and it's been a good experience, but we've kind of been doing it that way as opposed to taking a particular framework. We're pulling pieces from a lot of different frameworks. We're excited about the journey. Like you said, though, it's not always easy. And I feel like, and I have a colleague on the call who's also on the team with me, I feel as though we have a ways to go in terms of really getting into the messiness conversations. We've been doing this for over a year. We're still pretty polite, which is okay, but and there's still some people that are not as participatory as others, and just trying to figure out how we really push past that, and is my challenge.
It's all about trust building, isn't it? It's just a layer upon layer upon layer of trust building. And, I've yet to talk to anybody who's been on this journey who said, oh, in the first 3-5 months, we nailed it and we're just off and running. It's always been, which is a good thing because it's aspirational. It's always been, we're right here, but we haven't gotten here. We're right here and we haven't gotten here, which tells me that everybody's looking at progress, not perfection, right? Which is, kind of been the golden rule that we've tried to grab, because if you don't, it becomes very discouraging. The other thing is to know when you're stuck. And when you're stuck, what some often share is, first off, you acknowledge it. You just say it out loud. I think we're stuck, which is not bad. But then you change your behaviors because you're stuck, not keep banging your head against the same exercise thinking that you're going to get a different result. And so sometimes, like that it's hard to do, right? To get out, look at what's happening and then call it and then get back in it. But I think sometimes that's our role, right? It doesn't, and if you figure out the power dynamics, anybody can call it. But that's the hard part. And I think, Lynn, that's one of the things I think that you might be sharing, that you see it, you see the aspirational progress, but you may just have to call out, like, this is what I'm observing, and it's not good and it's not bad, but I just want to observe it. And I'm so glad one of your colleagues is here for you to have that conversation.
And Lynn, I think it's important to remember this is culture change. That takes time, right? To Kyle's point, it doesn't happen overnight. And I would encourage you, where you do see those glimmers of hope, right? I'm a big fan of Dan and Chip Heath's Switch. And part of the reason I'm a big fan of their model of change management is that it talks about the bright spots. How do we find the bright spots and continue to replicate them? And so I would encourage you, where you find those bright spots, celebrate them, name them, elevate them, right? Because culture change takes time. But part of culture change is noticing the things in culture that we're doing that we want to continue to replicate, and holding it up for everybody to see. This is what we want to see. And the more you can celebrate that and hold it up, the more those things are going to begin to take hold.
We have a question from the group that's joining us from the Midland Area Community Foundation. I want to make sure we invite you into this conversation.
Oh, sure. Actually, just a comment, and I really appreciate what Lynn said about sometimes we're too polite with each other. And we recently went through strategic planning, and we reaffirmed 3 of our values. We added value and we defined the values. Now we got to figure out how to live into the values, as has been the conversation today. But I think you're right. There's this delicate balance that we care about each other. I mean, I loved what you were talking about love, even defining that, but we're so polite sometimes that we need to have these really tough, authentic conversations about our values and how we live into them. And we have to get past the fear of not being polite. Because I mean, I think really as a field, we're very, polite to each other, but we have to have these really hard conversations. So we're working to live into that and have those conversations, and really how do we embrace and how do we really live our values?
I had popped in the chat box. I put it up there earlier. I just put it in again. There's a great exercise I use in my fundraising class around how do we identify our values and then take the next step to say, what does this mean to behavior, right? What behavior is connected to this value? And I think that can be really helpful sometimes. And yes, I'm a big Brene Brown fan, so we'll give a shout out to Brene Brown's work.
So we love Brene. Thank you for always bringing Brene in there. I would say, like, the last 2 comments really resonated with me. And one of the things I would offer around that, particularly with what you were saying, Lynn, too, is I think just continuing to have the conversation over time, because then, like, the more people talk about something or just kind of get used to being in the conversation, I think that helps with the discomfort. At least that is what we have seen. And I would say that to the Midland Area Community Foundation too, like just creating, like not just having, okay, here's an annual workshop or one-time thing with this, like really building it in, and over time it kind of unfolds. And then I would say the thing that has really been, that has helped us, but also another game changer is really attending to skill building, like not just assuming people can have conversations or even values clarification conversations. So we've done different versions of this throughout the years, but our most recent one has been looking at conversational capacity. It's an approach, Craig Weber is the guy who talks about it, but it was really about balancing this, how do you have difficult conversations with, in a productive, constructive way. And that's been really helpful, because I think when you call it guardrails, Tamala, but I also think about it as scaffolding, that kind of lays the foundation for us to be, like, you're giving people the skills to have those conversations, and then the time to practice them by continuing to hold the conversations. And I think those 2 things together have been really helpful. And then people will even reference it, like, okay, how, like, one of the concepts is like balancing candor and curiosity. So people will be like, well, I need like I'm needing more candor right now, or we'll ask each other, are we in the sweet spot? You know, like a whole language can develop around it that makes it a little bit easier to have those really tough conversations sometimes. So those would be my two sort of things that were coming up for me around that.
And the thing about politeness, the thing about that is sometimes that's because people are fearful. So creating safe space is so, so critical to those conversations, and being able to be candid and being able to be open. But safe space, you're not going to get there if you don't have safe space. People are thinking, what will people think of me? Will this harm me? My position that's lower in the organization. So please think about creating safe spaces where people can disagree and walk out of the room with a hug, with whatever, a virtual see you later, you know, and something that draws people in, that they're safe in this conversation and things won't happen to them. So.
And to be honest, some of that might not even happen with execs in the room. It might not happen. There might not be a such thing as a safe space if a CEO is in the conversation or a trustee.
Power. Go back to power. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe that means, you know, creating spaces and opportunities for peer groups within your organization. We have a manager to manager level meeting that we have, and we can just talk among each other. And maybe we lift things up collectively to leadership, but there are certain things that won't be said if a CEO is in the room or a supervisor.
Great point. When I was a CEO, I created spaces that I excluded myself from so that they could really have honest and safe conversations, knowing that I wouldn't be listening and I wouldn't be there. So that's an excellent point. At any leadership level, it might be just a supervisor that should not be in the room.
I feel like I'm the Hilton or the Marriott staffer who's walking in the room and saying, we have to clear the room now because other people need the space. Not that we need the space, but I want to respect people's time, and I know folks are dropping off. So thank you for joining this conversation. Thank you for joining the lobby. Thank you for our speakers and the CMF staff who put this all together. And thank you all for just giving of yourselves in this very important conversation. We had I think, great first start to a really meaningful experience with us all here together on our equity journey. And so please be safe, be well, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to CMF for creating the space.
Yeah.
Thank you, CMF. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, everybody.